Farming food and fashion for a discerning world is serious business in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There are new opportunities everywhere just waiting for the open-minded. Sarah's Country shines a light on the matters that matter most. And here's your host, Sarah Perriam.
Kia ora and welcome to Sarah's Country for another Opinion Maker episode where over the next hour with our guests and our panel, we're going to unpack one of the key challenges for New Zealand's food and fibre sector that we can set ourselves up for success with our consumers into the future if we get ahead of this key issue to our consumers that doesn't seem to be talked about a lot within our own rural media. And I want to know why, but also how we can set our dairy farmers and our beef farmers in New Zealand up for success early. There's a few key reasons that I wanted to delve into the topic of how to reduce bobby calves, but economically. First, it started with my sister. My sister Kate has recently had her first child. We grew up on a farm, but naturally to her who doesn't work in the farming industry, she still has outside consumer looking in questions. And she said to me, is there anywhere I can source milk from places where they don't take the calves off the cows at birth? And it was interesting for me. We raised bobby calves as kids. It was our pocket money. So she understands the concept of it. We lived on a farm, but still to her, the concept of a calf being taken off the cow when she herself was breastfeeding, it really made me stand up and say, right, I think we need to address this topic. The other thing too is that I am aware there's a lot of large farming operations in New Zealand that are setting themselves up for this trend, yet not many people want to still talk about it. However, I'm super proud of that farmer that did, and he is a dear friend of mine living locally here with me in this Lincoln Taitap area, and he has spoken about this at the South Island Dairy event recently with his equity partners in Mātua Hou, which is some young rural professionals who came together to rear bobby calves with a difference. And so he is also joining me shortly here in studio. It's a common dairy industry practice described so clinically as early life processing or low value non-replacement dairy calves, and the separation of calves from their dams is falling out of step with public values, putting dairy farming's social license to operate into the spotlight, and it is not going to go away. So why can't we start to talk about it? And that's what we're going to do over the next hour. And I have, as I said, David Williams is joining me here in studio. David, thank you so much for your time. And we have yourself on a panel with Dr. Sarah Bolton, who's done her Nuffield Scholarship in Australia on this particular topic. But before I introduce you and we talk about that presentation that you did at the South Island Dairy event and get the lowdown from Sarah, I want to first set the scene with Julia Jones from NZX, who I know will have some wise words on why we need to talk about this topic. We're going to kick off the Opinion Maker with NZX's Head of Dairy Analytics, Julia Jones, also sitting on the board of Meet the Need, an incredible charity that we so desperately need in New Zealand. Julia, thank you for coming on. This is a confronting subject. How do we reduce bobby calves but do it economically? It's a big topic, but I think one that needs talked about. So I appreciate you stepping in and having your say on this, because I don't know about you, but I think it's a big part of our future.
Yeah, it is. And it's a very polarizing topic. And I think at the moment we're in the habit of having conversations where something's good or bad and we're not seeking solution. And something like bobby calves has to be an integrated solution. It's not a dairy problem. It's not a beef problem. It's a New Zealand ag problem / opportunity. And I think that's where we need to kind of be more focused on, is getting that collective outcome from it.
It's an interesting one too, because it's a chicken and egg. It's like we have to find the economic value first before making behaviour change.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, right? Because we could, in fact, have a blunt instrument hit us with consumers, because there's animal welfare considerations. You know, ethics are a funny thing around this because everyone's different. So you're not going to win over someone that doesn't want an animal to die. So that's a different demographic, you're going to have people that probably don't like the concept of waste. So if we didn't have the bobby calf system, is that animal then wasted? And then you're going to have the people that potentially see the value in it but want to ensure the welfare of the animal is at its utmost, to the highest quality.
Why hasn't this been a directive from our milk processors? Can they not see consumer insight that this is coming?
I actually sometimes think that this is a little bit disguised. I think that we have got very offended by the likes of SAFE highlighting these issues. And I think they've actually done us a favour because they've brought it to the forefront. We do need to discuss it. I think our dairy and our meat processors need to talk about this together. I don't think this is just one lot. This is absolutely a conversation that's got to be had within the system around beef farming, dairy farming, and across all processors.
In the world of ESGs, there's some fantastic webinars. Follow Julia Jones and the work she's doing on this space. But when you're seeing it from an NZX perspective, a corporate responsibility, is this just an encouraging perspective that we will have to bring into corporate decision making, actually starting to, whether we like it or not, deal with the confronting situations that are happening in farming?
Yeah, we're going to have to deal with it because we're inside people's supply chains. So what will happen is, and it's kind of a funny cycle. So if there's someone offshore who has investors, then they're going to require whoever we're selling to. So for example, if it's meat company in the US, and then we're a meat company in New Zealand and we're selling into the US, then we're going to have to be really careful, because if they have to report on social issues, which animal welfare will fall into social issues, we're going to have to start recording social issues because the questions will be asked. So just because we might be mostly co-ops and our investors are our suppliers, it actually doesn't mean that we're going to get out of having to report on this. And it's going to be about transparency. And with transparency, we'll get trust. But with transparency, we have to face a few ugly truths.
So time to step up in the next 12 to 24 months and relook at how your business model can incorporate that and do that. This is the thing, Julia, is that we put out, KPMG agribusiness agendas now for 12 years, but we don't seem to be getting ahead of the headwinds.
No, we tend to be consequence learners. So we wait until the pain of not changing is far greater than the pain of change. And I think we can front run these things. Look, I'm not saying a right or wrong. I'm not an expert. You've got experts coming on to talk about how this could logistically work. But I think what we've got to do is not start to put our future at risk and then panic to try and find a solution. So, years ago when they brought the minimum standards in for bobby calves, and I've talked to lots of processors, the conditions of these animals increased considerably. So what more can we do? Are there other markets we need to think about? Do we need to be breeding less beef cows and have them coming through from dairy farms? I don't have the answers, but I don't think we're asking the right questions, and we don't have the right people across the conversation. This is an issue that will blow up, and it might not be this year and it might not be next, but when it blows, it won't be good. And let's prevent the blow and actually work as hard as we can to front run a solution.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your contribution, Julia Jones, Head of Dairy Analytics at NZX NZX, my apologies, and of course sitting on the board of Meet the Need. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you've heard it there from Julia Jones on why we need to pay attention to this conversation about reducing bobby calves in our New Zealand dairy industry. But is there an economic benefit if we can strategically do this right and get ahead of this headwind? Well, as I said, joining me in studio is David Williams, who spoke recently at the South Island Dairy event. David, thank you so much for coming in and also for broaching this topic. Can you give our audience a bit of an understanding of how you came to be a part of this Burnham property where you're raising calves with a difference, and the business model structure that you've created, and why?
We would probably start there as there was me and a few others that were just keen to get on the property ladder and do something with our money outside of our normal daily business. That property was small enough and affordable enough to do something. Suits calves really well, but calf rearing's quite a sort of go big, go home model, a bit risky financially. So we wanted to take the risk out of that, and on top of that, we're quite passionate about the dairy industry and some of the challenges it's going to have going forward. So we thought we'd position ourselves around or partner with farmers that have an interest in reducing their bobby numbers and are sort of going down that path without seeking a financial reward, because that might make our journey a bit easier. So where we went out and hunted for people to partner with was the ones particularly that are going to drop a calf off and then give us a little bit of cash up front and treat us more like a contract rear in order to get their calf to 100 kilos so that it's a bit more attractive for the beef farmer to pick up at that point. And the particular calves we were interested in were a lot of the dairy farmers that are having a go at introducing a lot of beef into their herd so that the calf isn't a byproduct anymore, it's a bit more of a beef product. Normally the calf rearers would pick out your best ones, like your black and white face bulls, and a lot of the heifers particularly would get left behind, and anything with a broken face. So that's where we've come in and said, look, we'll get those broken face or those heifers to 100 kilos, and hopefully if everything's cost a little bit less along the way, like we haven't bought that calf for $100 to start with, and we've been able to control our costs and fix it in with the farmer at like a contract rate, then that farmer should be able to sell that calf at 100 kilos through us for a bit cheaper than brothers and sisters that are black and white face bulls going for sort of $50 more. So we've had a crack at it.
And you are definitely still doing it, and it's there's so many more ways we can take this in regards to the economics around it. But this realignment depends on addressing the issue of the inherent low value, yes, and the potential to improve farm profit margins across the sector. But the opportunities, in terms of sex semen, targeted beef over dairy crossbreeding and making those markets is something I want to delve into with both our panels. So, of course, I naturally need to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Sarah Bolton, who did her Nuffield Scholarship in this space. She is the Project Officer for Animal Health, Welfare and Fertility at Dairy Australia, graduating from the University of Melbourne's Veterinary School in 2012, and has held roles in both private and government practice in this space. And whilst managing a 300-cow dairy farm with her partner, she was awarded that Nuffield Scholarship, where she travelled around the world researching the management of non-replacement dairy calves and dairy cow-calf contact in the context of public perception. Sarah, we talked a lot in this lead up to introducing you about, this is a topic in New Zealand that we are not having openly. Is this the same scenario in Australia?
The situation in Australia is slightly different at the moment in that we have a relative shortage of beef off the back of a fairly significant drought in the last few years, which resulted in really high rates of female breeder slaughter rates within the beef herd. So the appetite for beef from the dairy herd, from the meat sector, is probably higher than what it's been in recent times. And I guess that's combining with, an increasing realisation within the dairy sector that this is an issue that we do need to address, particularly from a public trust and social licence point of view. So happily, the conversation within the Australian beef and dairy sectors is actually relatively, constructive at the moment when it comes to the need to address this particular challenge. The question of how we do that in a way that's economically sustainable and socially sustainable as well is, the question that we're all still trying to answer. But generally, the attitude towards having the conversation is very positive.
Yeah, so an open dairy industry wanting to address the social licence issue before having to address the unprofitable nature of not going down this track, which if thought differently, we could. In your experience, David, what's the farmer appetite been of getting their head around a new system, a new business model whereby, we hate to say byproduct, waste product out of the dairy industry. These calves have a value if it was treated differently, but hanging out for $100 for bobby calves, it's not going to do anyone justice in the long run, right?
So I think the first question was, did I get farmers that were interested in this? Easy enough. And yep, that was our business model was actually taken up a lot easier than I thought, a lot quicker. We'd sort of told the bank when we bought the property that it would happen over a few years, that we'd find people that had aligned interests with ours, that had a focus on reducing their bobby calf numbers and weren't that interested in a financial reward for it. In the first year, we found enough farmers to partner with. We didn't get enough calves, but that's because we had a late start. But we found enough farmers to partner with that will probably fill our quota worth of calves through them moving forward. So great relationships kicked off there and no real trouble finding them. I forget the second half of your question.
No,
so.
That's cool. And Sarah, on that example from David, have you seen that appetite from farmers to looking to a different business model as well because they can see what's coming?
Yeah, I guess one thing that we're really noticing as we progress the conversation within the Australian sector is the need for a range of different options that suit different farmers. There are dairy producers that are really interested in diversifying their business into beef production, rearing extra calves on site and using perhaps lower value grazing land for finishing them themselves, and that's fabulous. And that ranges right through to dairy farmers who have little interest in calf rearing as it is and, possibly even consider contract heifer rearing at the moment and just want those calves, to be dealt with by another business as early as possible, still appreciating the welfare of those animals. So certainly alternative business models that really allow for potentially even creative ways around that. The rearing component, which seems to be one of the biggest rate limiting factors when it comes to practice change, is something that we need to be progressing with the conversation as well.
Yeah. Circularly, the conversations start in terms of the genetics that are put into the dairy cow as well. So therefore, it is attractive for rearers, and then ultimately beef farmers who take them through after 100 kilos. So is that sort of conversation starter happening of the circular system so that you're getting what you want? Otherwise, we've got sex semen, right? That's on the rise, and then that can deal with it too.
Yeah, I'd sort of probably add in a thought there. So with today's markets and with the tools that we have at us today, it's all sort of focused on producing a better product out of a better beef product out of dairy, where if you took it back a step and this really depends whether there's enough pressure that a whole industry is going to have to change, or whether there's only enough pressure that it presents opportunity for a few individual entrepreneur type people to start their own story, similar to like the Wagyu story or something like that. If you thought about it, that it was enough pressure at an industry level, then there's a really good argument that the dairy industry could quite strongly market dairy meat. And then, to be fair, with great marketing, you're always going to get a great product. So whether dairy meat, like a Kiwi cross calf that dairy farmers producing today, could go on and produce a good steak compared to a beef steak, is probably a different argument. That it's more about how well have we marketed that product, and could we market that product, and therefore that takes away from the argument, are dairy farmers working hard enough to get the good genetics, which is going back to your circular sort of chat there before, to get a good product to us as calf rearers that we can sell to the beef industry. So that if the dairy took complete ownership of the problem or the challenge, whether it's problems or not, it's probably subjective still, but if the dairy industry took ownership of that and didn't sort of look at the beef industry as someone that's providing us a service for rearing our calves beyond the farm gate, and instead took that product and thought, gosh, there's real value in dairy meat and the story around it and the efficiencies of not having a product. There'll be carbon stories there'll be environmental stories about raising that dairy meat animal, and you'll find the people out there that just want the meat because they want to feel good about what they are eating. So that's sort of probably more where I see it going than trying to push farmers to do the breeding programs that I want to be able to sell a calf to a beef farmer, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, you put that in context to a sheep farmer, when they chase a meat trait, then wool gets left behind. If you chase milk production traits, then potentially the focus comes off another fantastic byproduct. And if there's a business model that, of holding on ownership all the way through too, then maybe dairy farmers may be more interested in it rather than get rid of it. It's not my problem anymore. Sarah, do you have something to add to that conversation too and what you're seeing in Australia?
I think it's an interesting question that gets raised a lot in terms of, and it really begins at the dairy farm level of going, okay, well, if I'm going to rear these calves, or, we're going to move away from early life slaughter pathways, where are they going to go? And immediately the solution tends to be, well, I need market pull through for these animals. I need someone to be saying, hey, we want to buy this article that you've got. And certainly a lot of people then, move to the question of, do we need to be marketing dairy beef as its own particular product and doesn't need to attract a premium? And there are some small examples of that internationally that we have seen, but it's definitely a question that I don't think is completely answered, and I don't think we can 100% hold on to as this is definitely going to be our solution. I guess the flip side of that is considering, okay, well, how can we produce beef from the dairy herd that is going to be an article that processors or meat processors actually want, and how can we achieve that through beef crossing as well? So beef crossbreeding, sorry. So I think we need to have an eye on both. It's a question of, okay, well, how can we extract more value from this at the end of the supply chain? And could that be through, the conversation around whether or not beef from the dairy herd may have a lower carbon footprint or, higher marbling, et cetera, et cetera. But also, how can we just produce good quality beef from the dairy herd too that can hold its own in the commodity environment as well? And having an eye on both of those approaches is going to be important going forward.
David, what about the role of sex semen? Do you see that being a great alternative? I mean, in terms of your business model, what you're wanting as many calves as possible and to roll that out. But do you think that is a silver bullet that can help us address this in the dairy industry?
It's quite a big question. I wouldn't call it a silver bullet. With where the technology's at with it today, it's probably got a lot of logistical challenges around it, and it's a tool in the toolbox that can be used, and farmers can go back and use that as well as a lot of other options. It just really depends what products we're going to be marketing in the future and whether we're constricted to just those beef calves, and then in which case you're trying to get out, or dairy beef calves I should say, whether you're trying to get out just those out of your herd, or whether there's a place for other things like your Jersey and the rest of it. So in short, I'd sort of say no, it wouldn't be a silver bullet. It's just one tool in the toolbox of many other tools that are presented today.
What's the uptake of sex semen in the dairy industry in Australia looking like at the moment, Sarah?
It's definitely increasing, and we're seeing steady year-on-year increases in the uptake, but I definitely agree with David in that it's not a silver bullet. It is one part of, the many tools in the toolbox to be used together. And it's really interesting looking, for example, to the UK, where they've recently implemented their GB bull calf strategy, which uses language around what they describe as responsible breeding strategies. And the idea behind that is that at the point of mating decision making, you have a planned pathway in mind for every calf at joining, as opposed to trying to breed enough replacement females and then whatever else we get, we'll deal with at the time that it hits the ground. And so the opportunity with sex semen, whilst there are challenges because it depends, the success or otherwise of sex semen programs depends on so many other factors that are happening on the dairy farm as well, herd fertility not being the least of those. On the flip side, it provides us the opportunity to actually be much more targeted about the number of replacement females we produce, who we actually produce them from, and potentially higher genetic merit females in the herd as well, and potentially even invest more into rearing our replacement females, potentially even feeding more milk so that they can go on to fulfill their genetic potential and potentially even produce more milk when they themselves come into the shed. So the sex semen side of things has a lot of opportunities, but equally we've seen a lot of people have bad experiences when it comes to, okay, we'll just use sex semen and it'll fix all the problems, and not considering those opportunities holistically as well.
Is there any merit in keeping calves on mum for longer than 4 days, David?
I don't know about on mum. There might be merit from a acceptance from the public point of view. I don't know how much pressure, or I wouldn't know how to measure the pressure you get from the public in that. But you started this intro with that, and I think it's important to recognise before we go down the track of trying to fix all these problems, whether or not we've actually listened to what the general public's issue is. So, and one of the issues is we're taking them off the mothers quite early, and the second one is they end up going somewhere else after 4 days, and so we're working hard on the problem around them going somewhere else after 4 days. And if you ask that same question another way, say a farmer wanted to keep those calves in a calf pen for 10 days, there's value in that for us. But whether or not the first problem of that calf stayed on its mother for 4 days or not, I don't know that there's any benefit or not. It would be more of an emotive thing for the public, I would have thought.
Sarah, I'd really like this, your thoughts on this from a veterinary perspective. You've done your Nuffield scholarship in this, you've been around the world. The reason I asked this is I've been doing a lot of reading about sheep milking, and they have seen potential benefits in leaving lambs on and weaning periods and doing a lot of trials around that. Is there anything you've uncovered?
Yes, so the cow-calf separation issue is really interesting, and I never intended to look at that as part of my Nuffield, but my approach to bobby calves, very early on, I forced myself to answer the question of, do we really need to change? And of course, the economic argument is never consistent, at least in Australia. And so therefore approach my Nuffield very much through the lens of public trust and social licence. And when we look at early life slaughter of calves, public rejection of how we manage dairy calves is usually just as much about cow-calf separation as it is about early life slaughter. We know from social science that there is very widespread rejection within the public of early life slaughter, but there is also rejection of cow-calf separation. And I think from an industry perspective, dealing with early life slaughter is definitely our most pressing issue and, definitely more achievable. But in the long term, we do need to be setting ourselves up for the conversation around cow-calf separation. From a veterinary perspective, we've always been very clear about the reasons for separation in modern production systems, and they are very clear. And essentially, it's around colostrum management. We know that if we leave calves on dams, they're far more likely to have failure of passive transfer. It's around interrupting the transmission of Johne's disease, and it's also around stress on the animals. We know that if we leave them together longer, when we do separate them, it's more stressful. But having said that, there's more and more research coming out around well-managed cow-calf contact systems that can actually have health benefits, and that separation of the cow and calf is not necessarily a substitution for good management. So, for example, there's actually now, I'm told, a housed dairy system in Germany milking over 1,000 cows that are rearing calves on cows for the entirety of their milk feeding program. But it's been specifically designed and uses modern technology in order to make that system work and still protect the health and welfare of those animals. So I think in our current, modern or traditional dairy production systems, cow-calf contact is a really difficult thing to do well. But that's not to say that if you change the model, it can't be achieved.
David, this just seems like collectively a consumer's dream. As I started this is my sister who, has a lot more knowledge than an urban Kiwi consumer or a global consumer around the farm management system of bobby calves and why we do what we do, but still is asking the question of why can't we change our on-farm management systems to include both the work that you're doing and the work that Sarah just said as well, because collectively you could achieve a premium for the milk and even double for what we sell it for if consumers are demanding that. Is there the opportunity to pull together a bunch of farmers within New Zealand to sort of toll process milk on those values?
Yeah, I'll probably give Synlait a bit of a plug there actually, because I'm pretty sure their model now, they've got the ability to actually keep a smaller group of say 10 or 15 farmers separate from any other milk they produce. So say they had that group in, so using them as an example, if they had a group of farmers in their farmer collection base, that all wanted to go down the path of trying to leave their calves on the cows and rear them like that, they could definitely test the market for it. Is there a group out there that would want to sell that milk as a product, and how much more would be the premium? And then the flip side of that too is, because this is what makes it a complicated topic. So one, that's a dairy farmer making a premium for their milk, because they've basically tailored their farming practices, aligned them completely with what the public want. So they're getting the public trust through that. But then there's also, so there's a story around their milk, but there's also a story around that calf. That calf's had a good, happy life as far as the consumer wants, and probably regardless of genetics, whether there's beef in that calf or not, there'll be a good meat product come out of that, because that farmer's got a good story attached to that calf. So, and that was where I was trying to get to before about the dairy industry sort of marketing dairy meat, regardless of whether it's got genetics in it. It's really that story that's got to be told. And that story for a dairy farmer in that situation is told twice, once about the milk and once about the meat.
Sarah, this seems like a no-brainer. How can we make this happen?
I think it's something that needs to be approached cautiously. You know, if we all of a sudden decided to leave all the calves and dairy herds in Australia and New Zealand, you know, on the cows tomorrow, it would be a health and welfare disaster. And I think we also need to think carefully about how we're presenting it in a consumer fronting fashion as well, in that, you know, consumers do or are willing to pay premiums for products that they feel good about how they've been produced. But on the flip side, they also don't want to feel guilty about, you know, the products that they continue to produce. So we have to be careful about how we manage that, and not necessarily expect the consumer to pay more for systems to be run to, you know, the minimum expected standard, I guess. But I guess from my perspective, it really is an opportunity to set the industry up with one eye on the now and one eye on the 10 to 20 years time. And how can we address this collectively with, you know, a unified approach across the industry to address the most pressing issues that we can tackle at the moment, but also be doing the work now to set ourselves up to address the longer term things such as cow-calf separation that we're likely to be coming up against in the next 10 to 20 years. So it's an ongoing conversation.
If you had a few farmers tackle that journey now, that just for only the reason that they could be passionate about it, it does present the opportunity to address a lot of the issues on your own terms, as opposed to flip side, you being told, no, this is a compliance thing now and you just have to sort it out, and that will come as a cost to the business. So that having some people be proactive about it isn't saying that everyone should be doing this or setting what the standards are, but it is leading the way in that we might develop really practical ways of achieving it, where we look back in 20 years and go, oh, it's funny how we used to do things. It's actually quite easy doing this the way we're doing it today.
A huge example of that is what I grew up with, was mulesing merinos. I mean, you wouldn't even think about that in New Zealand anymore. We deal with fly strike in a different way because the consumers didn't want us to do that practice. Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to open the conversation more and more here in New Zealand. As Sarah has alluded to, in Australia it appears the conversation is more advanced, and they may get more of a lead on it by starting to work on and deal with those situations. But David, you raise a really valid point there, because, you know, Ian Proudfoot said to me in an interview on Sarah's Country back a month ago that you can't keep giving farmers no runway for change. And so therefore, if we can actually start to imagine that runway in advance before compliance comes in, the better. Sarah, is that a great way of looking forth for it from and what you're seeing as well? I mean, what's Dairy Australia doing to help support dairy farmers to see forth the future?
Yeah, I guess I always sort of think about it as, the bell curve of adoption of practice change, essentially. And as David mentioned, at the very leading edge of that bell curve, you've always got the people that are seeing the opportunity and, being very forward thinking and going, well, we actually want to get ahead of change and be implementing these things now. And those people, may be more creative thinkers or, see the world slightly differently and are going to be that smaller percentage of early adopters, which are fabulous. We can then use those brilliant opinion makers or thought leaders even to set an example for the rest of the industry to go, well, actually, this is something that we could achieve and how can we do that collectively? And then I think that's a conversation around how that middle of the bell curve can feasibly move, into that area of practice change as well. And then at the very end, within any industry, you've always got that very small percentage at the bottom or the tail end of the bell curve where we do require things like policy implementation or perhaps legislation compliance, etc., to lift up that bottom end. So, it's that carrot stick approach. How do we shift the middle of the bell curve? But from a Dairy Australia perspective, it's really about making sure that we're funding the right research, that we're implementing the right programs, that we're making the knowledge and information available to people. But also within my role, it's very much about harnessing that conversation as well, because this problem, if it was as simple as writing the fact sheet on how to do this and get it right, the problem wouldn't exist anymore. So this is definitely one of those complex, wicked problems where we need to bring everyone together and have that collective conversation and find the shared values within the industry as well. We talk about aligning our industry practices with public values, but there is a value in practice change here for the dairy farmer, for the milk processor, for the meat processor, for the retailer, for food service. Everyone through that value chain has got value to extract from practice change here. And I think we need to pull that and harness that sort of collective power there.
Fantastic. What an incredible way to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Bolton, Project Officer for Animal Health, Welfare and Fertility at Dairy Australia, and trained vet as well as Nuffield Scholar, and David Williams joining me in studio as part of an equity partnership of Mātua Hou and speaking recently at the South Island Dairy event on this same topic. How do we reduce our bobby calves numbers but do it economically? Thank you both so much for your time.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us wherever you are around the world. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Haere rā.